"Doctor, I'm really worried about her memory." That was my daughter's voice, Patricia, my firstborn. The doctor, a young man, probably 40, maybe less, leaned forward in his chair. I could hear the concern in his voice, the professional concern, the kind doctors are trained to perform. "What kind of symptoms have you been noticing, Mrs. Calloway?" And Patricia, my Patricia, she sighed, that long rehearsed sigh that I had been hearing for months by then. She forgets conversations, important ones. She asks the same questions over and over. Last week, she couldn't remember where she put her car keys for 3 days. She left the stove on twice. "Doctor, I'm genuinely frightened." The doctor made a note. I heard the pen scratch across the paper, and I sat in that chair, the patient's chair, the one closest to the wall, with my hands folded in my lap, looking out the small window at a parking lot, at a gray November sky, at a single bare tree pressed against the glass. I said nothing. The strange part was I hadn't forgotten a single thing they were talking about, not one thing. The car keys, I had put them in my coat pocket on purpose because my kitchen drawer had been sticking and I didn't want to fight with it in the cold. I knew exactly where those keys were every single day. The stove, I left it on low because I had a soup simmering and I'd simply stepped outside to check the mail. I was gone less than 4 minutes. The repeated questions? Well, I'll get to those. I hadn't forgotten a single thing. In fact, I was pretending. If you enjoy hearing the real experiences of someone who has lived long enough to see how complicated family can become, subscribe to this channel. Stay with me, because this story, I promise you, does not go where you think it's going. I want to take you back about 8 months before that doctor's appointment. It was a Sunday in March. Patricia had driven up from Columbus. She lives about 2 hours from me, in the house she shares with her husband, Gerald. Gerald sells commercial real estate, has for 30 years. Gerald is a man who sees everything as a transaction. I say that without malice. It's simply who he is. They came for lunch, which was not unusual. Patricia tried to come once a month or so. We'd eat, we'd sit in the living room, she'd update me on the grandchildren, her kids, my grandchildren, Tyler and Amber, and then they'd drive back home. That Sunday felt different, though. I couldn't immediately say why. It started small. Gerald asked me casually, the way he asks everything, whether I'd had my will updated recently. "Oh, you know," he said, cutting into his chicken, "we've been doing some estate planning ourselves, and it just reminded me, Ma, have you looked at yours lately?" He calls me Ma, has for 30 years. I used to find it endearing. "My will is fine, Gerald," I said. "It was updated 6 years ago after Harold passed." Harold was my husband. He died in 2018, pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. If you want to know what grief feels like at 77, it feels like the floor disappearing beneath your feet and never quite coming back. Right, Gerald said. "But things change. Tax laws change. You might want to consider a trust structure, something that makes things easier for Patricia down the line, avoids probate." "Gerald," Patricia touched his arm, "let's not do this today." He stopped. He smiled at me. I smiled back, but I noticed. The next visit, 2 months later, Patricia came alone. We sat on the back porch because May had come in warm and lovely, and I'd planted my tomatoes already, and I wanted to show her the seedlings coming up in the raised beds Harold had built the summer before he got sick. We were quiet for a while, the good kind of quiet that you can only have with someone you've known your whole life. Then Patricia said, "Mama, I've been thinking, have you considered whether this house is still the right situation for you?" I looked at her. "What do you mean, the right situation?" "Well, it's a lot of house for one person. 4 bedrooms, that big yard, all those stairs." She paused. "It might make more sense to think about something smaller, or a community, somewhere with more support." I was quiet for a moment. "Patricia," I said, "I have lived in this house for 41 years. Your father and I raised you in this house. I know every creak in every floorboard. I am not lonely. I am not struggling with the stairs. I have Rosa, who comes twice a week to help me clean, and I have my garden, which I have no intention of leaving." She smiled that smile, the patient smile. "I know, Mama. I just want you to think about it." I said I would. I didn't. But here is where it changed. Here is where I started to truly pay attention. It was a Thursday evening in July. Patricia had called, not to chat, but with a specific question. She wanted to know whether I had a copy of the deed to the house. "Why?" I asked. "I was just thinking about what happens if something ever happened to you, and how complicated it would be if we couldn't find the paperwork." "Patricia, I have a filing cabinet in Harold's old study. Every document I own is in that cabinet, organized by year and category. Your father was meticulous, and I have kept it that way." "I know, Mama. I just thought maybe I should have copies, for safekeeping." "The attorney has copies," I said. "Douglas Hartwell. You've met him. He handled everything after your father died. He has everything." A pause. "Right," she said. "Okay." She didn't ask about Douglas again after that, but 2 weeks later she called again and asked if I was sleeping all right, whether I was getting confused at night, whether I'd maybe thought about talking to my regular doctor about memory issues. I said I was sleeping fine, that my memory was fine. She said, "Okay, Mama," in that voice, that patient, slightly sad voice. And something in me went very still. I want to be careful here, because I don't want you to think I was being paranoid. I have known paranoid women. My own mother became convinced in her last years that her neighbors were stealing her mail. That is paranoia. What I felt was different. What I felt was pattern recognition. I am 85 years old. I have watched human beings behave for a very long time. I know what it looks like when someone is working towards something, when questions have a destination they're trying to reach. And something in the texture of Patricia's questions, the way they kept circling back to the house, to the finances, to my mental state, told me that there was a conversation happening that I was not part of. So I made a decision. Instead of confronting her, which would have only caused her to deny it and become more careful, I decided to do something that I suspect surprised even myself. I decided to give her what she seemed to be looking for, just a little, just enough to watch what happened next. The following Sunday, she called to check in, and when she asked how my week had been, I paused longer than necessary and said, "You know, I've been a little fuzzy this week. I went to the grocery store on Tuesday and I couldn't remember half of what I needed, ended up just coming home." silence on the other end, then softly, "Oh, Mama." That "oh, Mama" told me everything. I want to describe what I did carefully because it was not something I enjoyed. Over the following 6 weeks, I performed small, controlled acts of forgetfulness. I would call Patricia and then, midway through the conversation, ask her something I had already asked 20 minutes earlier. Not a major thing, something small. "Did you say Tyler made the soccer team?" I'd ask, when she'd already told me yes, he had. She would answer again, gently, and I would hear something in her voice, something between worry and, I have to be honest, something that sounded almost like relief. I repeated the story about Harold's old reading chair twice in the same phone call, just to see what she would do. She listened patiently both times, without pointing out that she'd already heard it. Now, any loving daughter who truly believed her mother was simply getting older and a little repetitive, any daughter who wasn't angling for something, would have gently said, "Mama, you just told me that a few minutes ago," laughed a little, made it light. Patricia said nothing. She just listened and stored it. Once, when she visited, I left my reading glasses on the kitchen counter and then walked back in and picked them up and said, confused, "Now, where did I put those?" when they were sitting right in front of me. She immediately took out her phone. I didn't see her text anything, but when she put it back in her pocket, her whole posture had changed, more purposeful somehow, more decided. I went to bed that night and lay in the dark for a long time. Harold used to say I had a gift for reading rooms. I told him it wasn't a gift, it was just what happens when you pay attention instead of talking all the time. I was paying attention now. 6 weeks after I'd begun my small performance, Patricia called to tell me she'd made an appointment with a specialist, a geriatric neurologist, she called him, for a routine cognitive evaluation. She said her own doctor had recommended it just to get a baseline. I agreed. Of course I agreed. By then I needed to know how far this was going. The appointment was on Wednesday morning in November. Patricia picked me up at 8:30. She was dressed professionally, slacks, a blazer, which I noticed because Patricia usually comes to see me in weekend clothes, jeans, a sweater. That day she looked like she was going to a meeting. We were mostly quiet in the car. She asked if I slept well. I said I thought so. She said I seemed tired. I said maybe I was. In the waiting room, she filled out my intake forms. She asked me my questions and wrote down my answers, but sometimes she wrote something slightly different from what I'd said. I watched her pen from the corner of my eye. When the nurse asked me my date of birth, I hesitated for just a second before answering. Patricia put her hand on my arm, and then we were in the office. The doctor, Dr. Mehta, a kind-looking man with wire-rimmed glasses, turned first to me and then to Patricia and said, "So, tell me what's been going on." And Patricia told him, "I want you to understand what it is like to sit in a room while your own child describes you as though you were already gone." She didn't look at me while she spoke. She looked at the doctor. She said I'd been confused about time, that I sometimes didn't recognize familiar people, that I'd forgotten important conversations. She said I'd wandered in the kitchen at night. I hadn't. I get up for water like any human being. She said I'd accused the neighbor's daughter of taking something from my porch. I had done no such thing. I had simply mentioned that I thought a package had been misdelivered. She described a woman who was dissolving, and I sat there in my chair by the wall with my hands folded in my lap. I said nothing. I looked at the window. I let the words fall around me like snow. Dr. Mehta spoke gently. He said he wanted to do some simple assessments. He asked me to draw a clock face. He asked me to remember 3 words and repeat them back after a few minutes. He asked me what year it was, who the president was, what city we were in. I answered, slowly, with the occasional hesitation, just enough. He made notes. He said he'd like to see me again, and perhaps order some imaging. He said to Patricia that these things take time to evaluate properly, that a single visit rarely tells the whole story, and in the meantime, we should focus on making sure I had proper support at home. Patricia nodded. She was already nodding before he finished the sentence. On the drive home, she held my hand at a red light. "It's going to be okay, Mama," she said. "I'm going to make sure you're taken care of." And I looked out the passenger window at the gray November trees. 2 weeks after the doctor's appointment. I want to set the scene carefully. Patricia and Gerald had come to stay for the weekend, which they said was to help me with a few things around the house. Gutters that needed cleaning, a loose banister on the back stairs. Gerald is handy when he wants to be. On Saturday evening, they thought I had gone to bed. I do go to bed early, that part is true, not performance. But I had come back downstairs for a glass of warm milk and a book I'd left in the living room. I stopped in the hallway when I heard their voices. They were in Harold's study. The door was slightly open. "The doctor said he wants imaging," Patricia was saying. "Once we have that, if it confirms what we're already seeing, it doesn't matter what it confirms," Gerald said. His voice was lower, more direct. "What matters is getting the power of attorney in place before she has a clearer day and starts asking questions. She's not going to fight it, Patricia. She doesn't have the capacity to fight it. That's the whole point." I stood in the dark hallway. I held very still. "The Riverside property alone is worth—" "I know what it's worth, Gerald." "Then you know why this needs to happen before spring, before she gets it into her head to update anything with Hartwell. Because once we have the POA and we've established incapacity, the account consolidation is straightforward. The house goes into a trust we manage, we sell when the market—" "She's my mother." A long silence. "I know that," Gerald said, quietly. "I know, but she's 85 years old. She can't manage this alone. We're doing what's right." Patricia said nothing. I stood in the hallway for another minute, then I went back upstairs. I did not get my book. I no longer wanted it. I lay in my bed in the dark, and I looked at the ceiling, and I listened to the house settle around me, and I thought about Harold, about the 41 years in this house, about the raised beds he built the summer before he got sick, about the filing cabinet with every document organized by year and category. I thought about the word incapacity. I thought about my daughter's silence when Gerald said, "We're doing what's right." She hadn't agreed, but she hadn't disagreed either. There was a follow-up meeting scheduled with Dr. Mehta 3 weeks later. Patricia had also asked whether I would be willing to meet with an elder law attorney she'd found, a man named Patterson, just to discuss options, she said. I said yes. I agreed to both. I spent the time in between being very quiet and very watchful. I was still performing forgetfulness when Patricia called, but inside I was doing the opposite of forgetting. I was remembering everything.
writing it down, in fact, in a small notebook I kept in the drawer of my bedside table. The morning of Dr. Mehta's follow-up, Gerald drove us because Patricia said she didn't want to have to navigate in the city. We sat in the waiting room together, the three of us. Patricia held my hand again. Gerald read something on his phone. Dr. Mehta brought us in together. He began by reviewing his notes from the first visit. He said the imaging results, Patricia had taken me for an MRI the week before, showed some mild atrophy consistent with normal aging, but no significant markers for Alzheimer's or vascular dementia. He said that based on the assessment and the imaging, he would classify any cognitive changes as mild and warranting monitoring, not intervention. Patricia leaned forward. But she does have some impairment, enough to warrant careful monitoring and support, yes, Dr. Mehta said. But I wouldn't characterize Mrs. May as incapacitated, not at this stage. Gerald shifted in his seat. Patricia said, but the things I described, yes, Dr. Mehta said carefully, and I'd like to ask Mrs. May directly today. He turned to me warmly. Elizabeth, how do you feel your memory has been lately? I looked at him, and then I straightened in my chair, and I spoke clearly in a voice that I have spent 85 years earning.
Dr. Mehta, I said, my memory is fine. My cognition is fine. And I owe you an apology because I have not been entirely honest during our visits together, and that was wrong of me. The room changed. It's hard to describe. It was like the air pressure shifted. Patricia went very still. Gerald looked up from his phone. I continued. Over the past several months, I have been pretending to be more forgetful than I am. I did this because I suspected that someone close to me was attempting to have me declared incompetent, not because they were concerned about my welfare, but because they wanted access to my home and my finances. Patricia said, Mama, I would appreciate it if you would let me finish, Patricia. She closed her mouth. I told Dr. Mehta about the questions Gerald had asked about my will, about the deed inquiries, about Patricia asking me to consider leaving my home. I told him that I had performed forgetfulness deliberately, and I described precisely what I had done and why. And then I told him what I had heard in the hallway. I had memorized it. I repeated it back nearly word for word. What matters is getting the power of attorney in place before she has a clearer day and starts asking questions. She doesn't have the capacity to fight it. That's the whole point. The silence in that room was extraordinary. Gerald opened his mouth, closed it. His face had gone a particular shade I had never seen on it before. Patricia was looking at her hands in her lap. Dr. Mehta was looking at me with an expression I will keep with me for the rest of my life. Not pity, something closer to respect. I reached into my handbag and I placed my small notebook on the desk. Dates, conversations, and specifics, I said, going back 8 months. I am not a woman who forgets. I am a woman who has been paying very careful attention.
I will not dramatize what happened in that room after I stopped speaking, because the truth is more ordinary and more devastating than drama. Patricia cried. She said she was sorry. She said she didn't know it had gone that far. She said Gerald had convinced her it was the right thing, that I would be protected, that she loved me. I believe that last part. That is the most painful thing to say, but I believe it. I believe my daughter loves me. I believe she also got frightened by my age, by the memory of losing her father, by a husband who speaks the language of assets and protection and prudent planning, and who had, slowly, over the course of a year, convinced her that what she was doing was an act of love. Gerald said very little. He sat with his hands on his knees and he looked at the floor, and that told me more than anything he could have said. Dr. Mehta was professional and compassionate. He noted in my file that there was no indication of cognitive impairment warranting intervention. He suggested gently that the family might benefit from speaking with a counselor. He asked if I wanted to discuss any further steps. I said I would handle things in my own time. I did not speak to Patricia for 3 months after that. It was the longest silence between us in her 57 years of life. I won't pretend it didn't hurt me. Every single day it hurt me. But I needed the silence. I needed her to sit inside what had happened and to understand it without me filling the space with forgiveness before she'd really earned it. She called me on Christmas Eve. She cried. She didn't make excuses. She said, "Mama, I am so ashamed of myself." That was enough. We talked for 2 hours.
Gerald and I have a different relationship now. Civil, careful. He will not likely ever be what he was before. Not that he was ever particularly warm. But Patricia is my daughter, and her marriage is her marriage, and I am not 20 years old demanding the world arrange itself the way I'd prefer. I have called Douglas Hartwell, my attorney. We have had several conversations. My affairs are in order. My wishes are clearly documented. The right protections are in place. The house is still mine. The raised beds are coming back in spring. Here is what I want to say, and I want to say it quietly, not as a lesson. When I was a young woman, I believed that the greatest losses of old age would be physical: slower movement, failing eyesight, the body winding down. I did not anticipate the particular loneliness of being underestimated, of having people speak about you in the third person while you are sitting right there, of being handled, of having your sharpness mistaken for its opposite, or worse, deliberately recast that way for someone else's convenience. I am not angry at Patricia, not anymore. I think she is a good woman who went along with something because she was afraid, and because love and fear and money have a way of getting tangled together in people until they can no longer see the knots they've tied. I am sometimes angry at Gerald, but that is a private matter. What I am mostly is clear. I know who I am. I know what I have. I know what I've built over 85 years with my own hands and my husband's hands, and the steady daily work of a life taken seriously. And I have learned something that I think is worth passing on to anyone who is watching over an aging parent or who is an aging parent themselves. The people who love you don't ask about your documents, they ask about your garden. At my age, people seem to assume that you've stopped paying attention, that the world has moved past you, that your eyes are softer now, less focused, that the slowness of your body means the slowness of your mind. But the truth, the real truth, the one I wish I could give to every woman and man who is sitting in that doctor's chair right now, hands folded, looking at the window, is that it's the opposite. You start paying attention to everything. You have to, because some people are counting on you not to. My name is Elizabeth May. I am 85 years old, and I remember every single word.